Okay, I'm going to talk you through some of the brief anatomy of the foot and ankle. Just going through the major bony structures. Obviously we have the lower part of the tibia, the lower part of the fibula, and these form a mortise which articulates with this bone, the talus, the talar dome here, forming the true ankle joint, which is also known as the talocrural joint. This is the body of the talus, this is the posterior part, and the anterior plafond, which then articulates with a bone on the medial side known as the talus bone, which articulates with the navicular, forming the talonavicular joint here. Then we have the heel bone, also known as the calcaneum, which articulates on the lateral side with the cuboid, forming the calcaneo-cuboid joint. And then there's a space between the two bones, the talus and the calcaneum, known as the sinus tarsi. And there is actually a ligament that sits in there called the interosseous ligament, which keeps those two bones together. The calcaneo-cuboid and the talonavicular joint together form what's known as the midfoot joint. And then we have some smaller bones here, 3 bones, called the lateral, middle, and medial cuneiforms. We then have the 5 metatarsal bones, counting from 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th, and then we have the phalanges. Important ligamentous structures in the foot and ankle. There is a membrane running all the way down between the tibia and the fibula, known as the interosseous membrane. And there are actually ligaments holding the 2 bones together at the bottom. And then on the inferior portion between the anterior tibia and the anterior part of the fibula, there is an anterior inferior talofibular ligament, and then its corresponding partner posteriorly, the posterior inferior talofibular ligament. That's what keeps the tibia and the fibula from spreading apart. We then have the lateral ankle ligament complex. We have a thickening of the capsule, which forms, in effect, 3 distinctly identifiable ligaments, which are the anterior talofibular ligament running from the anterior portion of the fibula to the talus, a calcaneofibular ligament running from the calcaneum to the fibula, and a posterior talofibular ligament, which is less frequently injured than the other 2. On the medial side, there is the deltoid ligament, which comes from the medial malleolus and has multiple projections going to the talus, the calcaneum, and even the navicular. This is a very strong ligament, which is very difficult to rupture in comparison to the relatively easily ruptured lateral ankle ligament complexes. Other important bony anatomy includes the base of the 5th metatarsal. This is a point of insertion for the peroneus brevis muscle. Important muscles in the foot and ankle. We have the tibialis anterior muscle, which comes down over the front shaft of the tibia and is a dorsiflexor of the foot. On the medial side, we have the tibialis posterior, which runs behind the medial malleolus and inserts into the navicular. Important muscles in the foot and ankle. We have the tibialis anterior running down the anterior compartment of the foot. This is actually a dorsiflexor of the foot. On the medial side, we have 3 muscles known as Tom, Dick, and Harry. The flexor hallucis longus, flexor digitorum longus, and tibialis posterior. The most important one clinically is the tibialis posterior, which runs behind the medial malleolus and inserts onto the navicular and is an inverter of the foot. On the lateral side, running posteriorly to the lateral malleolus, we have the peroneus longus and brevis. The peroneus brevis inserts onto the base of the 5th metatarsal. The peroneus longus actually crosses underneath the foot all the way over to the other side to insert on the base of the 1st metatarsal, and these are both everters of the foot. The clinical importance of the tibialis posterior muscle is that as well as being an inverter of the foot, it also maintains the integrity of the medial longitudinal arch. Finally, on the posterior aspect of the joint, you have the gastrocnemius and soleus muscle complex, which eventually merges into the Achilles tendon. The Achilles tendon inserts onto the very posterior aspect of the calcaneum, and you can get mid-portion Achilles tendinopathy a couple of centimetres above the insertion, or you can get insertional tendinopathy very much where the tendon inserts onto the bone. There is a continuous fascial structure which continues all the way around the posterior heel and actually is continuous with the plantar fascia of the foot. The plantar fascia arises from the medial aspect of the calcaneal heel spur and then spreads out in fan-like projections to insert onto the bases of all of the metatarsals. And it's the plantar fascia which maintains the arch of the foot also.
So when we're examining the foot and ankle, we can start to look in the standing position to have a look at standing resting posture. So if we look at Matt here, if we're unsure whether he's in his resting standing posture, we get him to march on the spot a few steps and then just get him to rest, then we know that we are reaching his resting posture. There are a few landmarks that we can look at. So if we reach either side of the knee, we can check in terms of where the knee's facing, and if we drop then a line in between the knee through the calf, down towards the heel through to the floor, we can get a good idea in terms of where his rear foot is positioned. And with Matt here, you can see it's in a reasonably neutral position. With some people, we'll find that the more weight is taken across onto the inside, and we have more of a valgus positioning, and then in others, we get more of a varus position with the weight more distributed onto the outside of the foot there. If we come forward to one of our other landmarks in terms of the navicular, that can also give us an idea in terms of what the posture's doing around the medial arch. So we can see where our navicular is on the inside here, and there's a reasonable lift and posture through the forefoot there. If this was dropped, then that's what we more commonly call pronation. And to be honest, there's a certain degree of pronation in most subjects that we assess. Coming into standing, we can have a look at a calf raise. If we get Matt to lift his heels up here, in the normal functioning foot and ankle, we should see this rear foot varus position here. Now this is indicative of a well-functioning tibialis posterior muscle, which then inserts into the navicular here. And if we drop Matt back down, if we don't get that rear foot inversion or varus position, then we might suspect some pathology or injury to the tibialis posterior tendon. So if we go to look at calf raise, if we go back into the calf position here, this also gives us a good opportunity to look at repetitions, looking at how the calf muscle complex itself fatigues, and looks at the integrity of the tendo-Achilles complex. So if I get Matt to actually go onto his heels, yeah, great, and back down. Just repeat it.
Okay, great.
So with the calf raise, we can look at double leg calf raises, and what adds a lot more value is to look at a single raise calf raise. So if we look at a raise here, we can look at the height. So the height will enable us to look at both muscle function and the range available at the ankle. If we drop you back down and repeat again on the other side. The lift there, and back down.
Okay, recording.
So if we're looking to gauge how much flexibility we've got at the foot and ankle complex, we can look at a knee to wall test. So if I get Matt here just to drop his knee as close as he can towards the wall whilst keeping his heel down on the floor, and we can just monitor the alignment at the heel there and make sure the heel doesn't turn in too much with that. And then bring him back and compare to the other side. Can you go back a bit further on that one, Matt? So the heel's just about to lift there, so you can see there's not too significant changes between his left and his right ankle flexibility with Matt. So when we're looking at examining the foot and ankle on the couch, we're going to have a look to see whether there's any swelling, so looking around the sides of the ankle, around the lateral malleolus, around the medial malleolus, and having a feel to see if we've got any palpable swelling around the joints. And then if we go to look at range of movements, we can then get to have a look at some active movements. So if I ask Matt to point his toes down, and we look at plantar flexion. Plantar flexion is very important in terms of looking at long-standing ankle injuries. And then if we bring you back and then looking at dorsiflexion, we can compare right to left in this position quite easily to have a look and add a little bit of overpressure onto these movements to check end feel and range that we have available. We can move on to look at inversion. So if we get Matt to point his toes inwards, again comparing for range, adding some overpressure across onto those movements to look at the integrity of the movements and the lateral ligament complex in inversion, and then eversion, moving outwards, and again adding some pressure at the end of those movements to just check the range and the feel to those movements. We're looking at palpation around the foot and ankle complex. We can palpate around the lateral malleolus, feeling across around to where the calcaneofibular ligament attaches, moving forwards and around the gutter just below the lateral malleolus, around to the front to where the anterior talofibular ligament attaches, and moving across to its attachment onto the talus. We can come down then across. There are areas around here that can be a bit tender, such as the sinus tarsi. And then we drop down onto the fifth metatarsal, which is the bony bridge here, and palpate down the shaft of the fifth metatarsal. On the inside, we again can have a look and feel around the medial malleolus. Move around and across, and this can lead us down onto the navicular and its attachment of the tibialis posterior tendon, and then across towards the calcaneum, where we can hit across onto the spot of the plantar fascia. Here. We come across over to here, we can pop the ankle into different positions. If we find it easier to feel across onto the head of the talus, palpate across the front of the joint, looking again for tenderness and comparing between right and left. So in prone, we can have a look at the integrity of the tendo-Achilles complex. We can actually press, squeeze into the calf, and you can see there the movement at the foot as I squeeze into the calf. So this is Thompson's or Simmons test, and that shows there's some integrity in the Achilles. Obviously, you can further look at that by actually getting Matt to push down into my hands. Push down for me, Matt, and palpate along the Achilles tendon while you're getting a contraction. The Achilles tendon itself, we can also look in an unloaded position, have a feel through in terms of any thickening or nodules across the tendon, which sometimes can be more noticeable in terms of passive plantarflexion and dorsiflexion. As we come down to the back of the ankle, we can feel into the back and we can feel into the insertional part of the Achilles. So for our draw test, we're going to look into fix across the head of the talus, and we're looking at movement of the tibia and fibula across the front of the joint. So we can look at the movement forwards and looking at the integrity of the ligaments around the ankle joint. You can also look in more of an extended knee position. So the alternative position is with the knee extended, and where you grasp around the back of the calcaneum, cup in the back of the calcaneum, hand again across the tibia and fibula, and then looking at that pull forwards of the calcaneum and feeling the end feel for the joint integrity. You'll notice in this, with the anterior jaw in this position, we assess in slight plantarflexion because it's very difficult to get range in a dorsiflex position. So the ankle will position in plantarflexion as we start the movement. We can use the talar tilt to look at more of the calcaneofibular ligament contribution to the ankle stability. And we do that by actually, again, fixing across the tibia and fibula and actually looking at that passive inversion with those joints blocked.
In the forefoot, a useful test to assess for synovitis, for example in inflammatory arthritis, is the simple metatarsal squeeze test. Obviously you can assess the toes for the presence of synovitis, swelling, redness, a boggy feeling around the joint. And then the metacarpal squeeze test, just a simple squeeze on the feet to see if it produces pain. Very similar to this when assessing for a Morton's neuroma or a interdigital neuroma, which is usually between the second and third metatarsals, is a squeeze of the metatarsals and at the same time with the index finger pushing upwards and feeling for the classical Mulder's click. That's assessment for a Morton's neuroma. I'm demonstrating some simple exercises now for ankle inversion. This is the tibialis posterior muscle with the TheraBand. Just bring the TheraBand into tension and then a pure inversion movement at the ankle without any movement of the leg. And you can see that he's exercising his tibialis posterior muscles and to a small extent also the FHL and the FDL. To exercise the perineal muscles, just bring the TheraBand through to the other direction and bring the tension onto the other side. And again, a pure eversion movement. When doing the exercise alone, the TheraBand can be tied to an object such as a radiator or a chair, as long as it doesn't move.
So another exercise that can be easily done at home is looking at calf raises. So we can look in this position very nicely at the ability for Matt to gain height. So we can look at height between right and left in this position, and also how easy he finds it to get some depth in his heel drop. So again, comparing his range between right and left. This can be used as an exercise at home for mobility, but also it can be used for more for a strengthening exercise. So if we get Matt to work across onto the one side, so he moves across onto his left side, and then we look at the lift through and down, and we're looking for control through range and the range that he can achieve on both legs. We can assess the muscle fatigability with this, so we can look at how many he can do on his left to his right, and then use this to actually get him to gain some symmetry between right and left leg.